Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got a tray out on the table that I'm about to work on, and I got some information about that tray written here on this board. So I thought I'd go over it really quickly before we get started. And this is a tray of ENCs, European night crawlers. They're one of the types of composting worms people use, in addition to a whole bunch of other types that are suitable for worm composting. These European night crawlers have been in this system here for 139 days. Originally I had only one system with ENCs in it, and it was 139 days ago that I finally decided I'd like to have more than just one, sort of a backup plan just in case something ever went wrong with that other system. But this system has now kind of reached that point where I think it's almost time to start gearing it up for harvesting the compost out of here. The system has gone through a couple different phases at this point. So originally I let the system run for 99 days, and during that time the system received 15 feedings, and you'll see it's 15 plus 1 because of the 16 is the total number of feedings, because I had transitioned the system out of its original phase 1, the regular composting phase, to what I treat as sort of a foraging phase, phase 2. And I let it go for 28 days, almost an entire month. And then I sort of took pity on the system, and 12 days ago I threw a little bit of food in there. That's what that little check mark there indicates. So it's really 15 plus 1 feeding during the time when it really should have received no feedings during this foraging phase. But now, all in all, we've been foraging in this bin for 40 days, and I'm definitely curious to see where we stand as far as the material in here goes. I don't know if we're going to be ready to transition today over into the next phase, which in my book is usually, well, let me talk about what the completion of foraging is. To me, the end of foraging is when they've really picked through all the small particles of material in the system and broken it all down, and you've got a tub of what you really consider to be nice harvestable worm castings. So, if that's what we feel that's in here, I'm going to switch over to migration. And migration, I like to try to get the worms to exit the finished compost on their own, which means I would, just take one of the edges of the bin, set up a nice fresh feeding area, and after, no food for this long, this bin is probably a hungry bin, so these worms would be very pleased to get some fresh food. And during that time, besides giving them food to be drawn over to, I'll also allow this system to dry out a bit. Let it evaporate, let it become less and less appealing for the worms to remain in, serving as another motivator to get them to exit the castings on their own. So I'm going to put on a glove, take off the coverings, and we're going to see where we stand with this and whether or not we're ready to switch from foraging to migration. All right, let's get started. So now during that time when as I referred to it earlier, I took pity on this bin and I broke down and gave it some food. I think I was really just having pity on myself for having too many kitchen scraps piling up in the freezer and needing a place to put them. And that's how they ended up in this bin, because I had nowhere else to put them. And now it's starting to come back to me. 12 days ago, or almost 2 weeks since this bin was last worked on. So it was a little bit foggy in terms of where we left off. Look at that, it was like a ditch right down the middle. And that must have been where I placed that last feeding. And that material was definitely materials that should break down pretty quickly. All leafy stuff, some of it had already started going bad, so it was already kind of breaking down on its own. And these are just a couple coffee filters, because I always like to have sort of a little, a little covering somewhere between the plastic and the bin or whatever. If I'm not using plastic, I just like to have something in between the material in the bin and whatever I'm covering with at the time. And on that topic, we're not putting that plastic back. And if in fact we're now, trying to let the bin dry off, I've got a piece of newspaper we can lay across the top in the place of the plastic. And that'll immediately start allowing the bin to shed some of its moisture. And keeping it really damp has always kind of been the aim here, because as long as the materials are all damp, the all the microscopic organisms have the moisture they need to remain active, and then following suit, all the other life forms in the system have a much easier time breaking down the foods. So yeah, the material is definitely pretty, pretty damp. I think it's going to do it a lot of good to not have plastic coverings. If nothing else, I would like to at least start removing a lot of the large bits that I encounter as I go through the bin anyway, kind of aerating it all and checking it all out. I think I am just going to go ahead and collect anything that's pretty large, set it aside, and maybe use it when it's time to set up that migration feeding area. But if it's not today, then the foraging will continue, but they'll have fewer distractions in the form of large chunks of leftover food. They'll really be required to whittle down whatever else is in the bin that they can find, and hopefully it would be some of this sort of leafy sticks. That's just a mistake, I think, on my part to have even used leaves, and obviously the leaves are not the problem, it's their stems. I think using the leaves late in the game as bedding results in, a lot of little sticks and stuff in your material when you'd really just prefer to have almost harvestable material. I thought I saw a little flash of green. So everything was kind of leaves, basically, last time. I'm not going to try to collect stuff like that up. They can have it at this point because it's hardly leaves anymore. It's really just mush. So let them have at that. After 12 days, they've done a pretty good job, I think, on most of it. I would think that what survives here is just stuff that must have been clumped up and not easily, accessible from all sides. Yeah, you blend this stuff in, it'll break down a lot quicker than if it's all clumped up. So me blending it in here like this is going to definitely help with its consumption. I'm not finding a lot of other large chunks. I mean, okay, here's some more of that goo, leaf goo. Sometimes when I'm at this sort of stage where I'm feeling like I want to pick out large stuff, that might take a long time so they could focus on the small stuff. The stuff that is staying in, the small stuff, obviously the goo like this, that's not worth trying to fish out. Try to blend it around too, to not only increase its surface area, but just spread it out so that hopefully it, just gets broken down a lot more readily, a lot more quickly. Some of these things that I'm picking out that have this interesting brown color they're the seeds of avocado that I had chopped into little tiny pieces. Just helps the material break down a lot more quickly. Yeah. I somehow can't, I'm trying to imagine possibly starting into the baiting of the material and getting the worms to start moving out of it. There's not a lot of stuff in here. I mean, look at everything I've picked up as I've gone through, and I think I've covered more than half the container here, and we've hardly picked up any large pieces. I mean, if this is, maybe it would make sense just to set this system up for migration. The 12-day-old stuff, there's little bits and pieces of it. It's been just pretty much for at this point smeared about the whole system. Definitely won't last long that way, since it's already kind of goo anyhow. And now it's really just been tossed all over the bin to be easily consumed all over the place. It's all very moist, and as you would imagine, right down the middle where the feeding was happening is perhaps the most moist. Most moist. Very gooey, and definitely time to let this bin start airing out and drying off. I think if my memory serves me correctly, the notes that I've got indicates that I launched this bin with what I estimated it to be only 500 worms, and after, how long is that? Almost 5 months now, I guess. I would imagine that a lot of worms could have potentially been born here. One of the other worm channels I was watching seemed like it was employing an interesting sort of way to actively monitor how the growth of your population is doing. And it was to, see if I remember this correctly. I can't remember the exact numbers or anything like that, but what stuck with me was how a system was given a specific amount of time with a specific number of worms to begin with. And each bin is checked in on after that specific amount of time to have whatever worms are in it at that time separated from the material that they're inhabiting and weighed. So then, you know, there's that starting point of what, you know, what number of worms you had or what mass of worms you had in terms of their weight. And then at the end, after some given amount of time, where I assume it's all about reproduction and seeing how many more worms you have, or perhaps it's a combination of that plus maybe how have your worms grown, you know, in terms of transforming consumed food into bodily growth and just a lot of little worms becoming bigger, fatter worms. Decisions. I'm almost done here foraging through. It feels like I'm foraging at this point, picking off stuff. But I've really not encountered a lot of large stuff. The only thing that really kind of like sticks in my side is all of the presence of these little tiny leaf stems. Too many of them to be picked out individually that way. The other thing I'm observing, which makes me wonder, is a lot of little white specks, and I use crushed up eggshell in my systems as grit to help the worms break down the foods that they're eating. So it could be that, you know, it could just be little specks of grit that I'm seeing sparkling here and there within my compost. The little white stuff, or it could be little creatures. I'm wondering if it'd be worthwhile just to shoot a little bit of this top surface now that the whole thing's been agitated, and watch it back in sort of a fast playback mode to see what's creeping and crawling and how much of it there is, if any, and I'm sure there is some. Might be interesting to see. Oops. Maybe we'll try that. Give that a go. The one real nice thing that I like about this point is where I start to just really slow down and look throughout the material, and all over the place there's just cocoons. And I don't know if the video can pick them up, but I see them all over the place. I see only a few other larger chunks of material. Everything else is just kind of a goo. And I think it is time to give this thing a little chance to air out, let some of this really damp stuff start to dry up a little bit. It's kind of good that it's all clumpy like this because the air can get in underneath. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring one of our covering papers back, one of these coffee filters. And all these little leftover scraps of food and whatnot that we found, all these larger chunks of stuff. And it's really not much. I just wanted to bring it out onto this piece of paper to make it a little easier to see. But you know what? At this point, if we get this out of the picture, for the most part we've got, you know, a tray full of material that's got hardly any scraps in it. And I just need to accept the fact that all these little leaf stems are just going to be there to either continue to be there or continue to be there and, you know, possibly break down a little bit over the next couple weeks or whatever amount of time that follows. But it is time to let this bin start drying off. And if you've ever seen one of these on my channel, then you'll also know that it's also the day that we're going to separate these castings from a nice fresh feeding area and let these worms start moving out of this stuff, find themselves greener pastures, fresh food, a nice recirculating supply of moisture, and there's not much to it other than just making some room for it. So let's just sort of arbitrarily move some of this material away from this edge. Give ourselves a nice clean area to set up in. I don't think we need a lot of space. I usually don't build very huge feeding areas. But I think this way we give ourselves enough room to work pretty comfortably. To get this job done, I've got a whole bunch of paper, bedding materials, similar to those pieces of paper that were covering the top. These are just the cones that haven't been ripped open flat yet. They're still in the shape of a cone. I even have one that still has the coffee in it. But the main course when it comes to feeding this feeding zone is this lovely pile of different stuff. The darker little red stuff, purple stuff, that's all grapes. Green, there was all kinds of different leaves, a whole bunch of celery, mainly celery, so I think a lot of that white specks that you see are celery. This thing's been in the freezer for a few days now. I finally just broke down and got the food processor out and made a nice little slurry of worm food, all finely chopped. There might be a couple larger chunks here and there in it, but I did try to fish those out, and I thought that I'd gotten the majority of them. So in here, as long as we're talking bedding, we already kind of had one piece of our bedding ready to go over here with some nice jump-started food in it. But we did have two, so let's bring both of them over here. Stuff will serve nicely as our bedding underneath this feeding area. Got another one here. I'm thinking of punching a few holes through these things so they don't end up being an obstacle in anyone's way trying to get to food. Okay, so on this thing I punched a few holes into it with my knife. It seems inevitable that I might have to touch this stuff, but no, I could use my knife to try to continue cutting through. I've already kind of shaped a nice candy bar size hunk of delicious food for them. Stuff actually breaks through pretty easily. All I did was I kind of poked my knife through a little gently to sort of perforate it ahead of time, and then it all pretty easily wedged away from the rest of the block. Oop. Okay, so I think another generous hunk just like that should do quite nicely. And we haven't even used half this thing as far as I could tell. When I'm using bedding to build one of these migration areas, I want to try to keep those chunks of bedding pretty big, because at one point I'm going to want to haul some of the worms that have gathered into this section out of here. But I'd really not want to take all the bedding and everything that was placed out there to lure them in away, because that stuff's already nicely broken in. So I try to leave the bedding bits pretty large, so it makes it really easy to just shake off the worms and whatever else is on them and recycle them when I'm rebuilding the feeding areas. Well, I think we're approaching that point now where we're going to have to break out the secret weapon. And this is really not meant to be any sort of a obstruction for the worms. That's why it's all littered with holes. Riddled with holes? Littered with holes? It's full of holes so that it's really easy for the worms to get through it. Don't want it to serve as an obstacle. Just want it to serve as a visual aid for me to see where the castings end and where the baiting area begins. Alright. Guess this stuff will settle, I assume, once it thaws out a bit. But I've also got some other yummy stuff to add to this bait station. Here too, we'll let this filter also turn into a nice piece of bedding. I've got a couple more of them left. I think we could, yeah, we'll use one more. I don't know if we need much more. Stuff in here is all pretty dry, with the exception of the food. Although the food too, I drained off a lot of the liquid that came out of that ground up celery and grapes and everything else, and just poured it off. Some of it's frozen into that block, but a lot of it was just poured off, reducing the moisture level of that food a lot, I would assume. Alright, so I folded up this really nice piece of paper, custom made to fit perfectly over the top surface. But I guess we should get this to stick down, not be in our way. The only thing that I'm excluding at this time is going to be the covering over the feeding area. I'm going to put a piece of plastic directly over where the food is. It'll be the same plastic that we were using before, but I'll have to give it time to dry. I'm going to shake off all the castings. Then I could fold it up neatly to cover up just this edge of the bin. That's going to cause this area to stay nice and damp and become really, really cozy for the worms, giving the rest of this stuff, you know, time to dry off, hopefully. And that officially gets us out of foraging and into migration at this point. So this will start drying off nicely as time goes on. I'm curious to see how long this migration takes. The material is pretty far gone, but it is littered with little leaf stems, so there is stuff in there to eat. I did blend in a bunch of the leftover gooey food that I had placed in here 12 days ago, so we'll see. Alright everyone, that's the end of the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.